September 16, 1944. The Loire River Valley, central France. 20,000 German soldiers are about to surrender to an opponent they have not been fighting, because the opponent they have been fighting has already gone. The paradox of the Loire surrender is the paradox of the Patton advance at its most operationally complete expression. The Third Army moved so fast across France in August and early September 1944 that it did not fight the Germans in the Loire Valley at all. It bypassed them. It swept around them to the north, in the specific and operational movement of an armored exploitation that does not stop to clear the pockets of resistance on its flanks when the operational objective lies ahead, and the momentum whose maintenance is the exploitation's essential characteristic would be broken by the lateral operation. The Third Army crossed the Loire at Orléans on August 16th and at Blois shortly after, and drove east toward the German border at a pace that the operational record documents as 30 miles per day at its maximum. Driving east, while the garrison forces in the Loire Valley's fortified towns and river positions were left behind the advance, cut off from the German main body, cut off from supply, cut off from the command structure that would ordinarily be issuing their orders. They were not surrounded in the operational sense of forces being pressed by combat on all sides, not the encirclement of the Falaise pocket, whose compressed geography and the Allied army's converging advance had produced the specific and irreversible tactical situation of an encircled force. They were bypassed, left in a geographic pocket that the American advance had rendered strategically irrelevant, occupying positions that no longer connected to any German front line in any direction, defending ground that no longer served any German military purpose that a professional operational assessment could identify, and receiving orders from a German command structure that was itself in the process of the desperate reconstitution of the Western Front along the German border, whose distance from the Loire Valley had been increasing at 30 miles per day throughout August. Orders from headquarters that were moving east faster than the Loire garrison could decode the communications that arrived. By September 1944, the Loire garrison's strategic situation is the situation of an army that has been left behind by the war, not in the emotional and metaphorical sense of soldiers who feel abandoned by their command, but in the specific and operational sense of a military formation whose geographic position no longer connects to any operational front line, whose supply chain has been severed by the advance that bypassed it, and whose orders from the German command structure above it have become increasingly nominal as the distance between the Loire Valley and the German front line grows to hundreds of kilometers, and the disruption of the German communications infrastructure makes the transmission of operational orders to the Loire garrison an increasingly theoretical exercise rather than a functioning command relationship. The Loire garrison represents one of the most operationally complete demonstrations of what the Third Army's August 1944 advance through France produced as a strategic byproduct, the secondary effect of an exploitation that was primarily aimed at the German main body and the German border, but whose depth and speed incidentally created the isolation of every German garrison force in the advance's rear area. Not just the destruction of the German formations in the direct path of the advance, whose operational record the standard histories of the Lorraine campaign and the pursuit across France document in the combat reports, and the casualty returns of the formations that fought and defeated the German units in their path, but the isolation and eventual collapse of the German formations in the areas the advance bypassed, the garrison forces whose purpose was to anchor the flanks and control the river crossings of a defensive line that ceased to exist when the Avranches' breakout converted the Normandy campaign from the attritional contest of the bocage hedgerows into the mobile exploitation whose depth and speed the German defensive system had no operational mechanism to track. The Loire itself, France's longest river, 625 miles from its source in the Massif Central to its mouth at Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast, draining the agricultural heartland of the Touraine and the Anjou in the specific and pastoral geography of a valley that every French schoolchild learns as the Garden of France, had been part of the German defensive planning as the natural obstacle whose width and whose crossing infrastructure could be defended, and whose line could anchor the German withdrawal from southern France. The withdrawal of Army Group G, under General Johannes Blaskowitz, that has been moving north and east since the Allied landings in southern France on August 15th, trying to reach the German main body in the northeast before the encirclement, whose possibility the American advance's depth and speed has been creating, was supposed to be covered on its western flank by the Loire's defensive value, by the garrison forces in the towns along the river whose presence would protect the withdrawal corridor and prevent the American forces from crossing to threaten the retreating German columns. The Loire as defensive anchor was consumed by the pace of Patton's advance, in the same way that every other German defensive plan for the defense of France was consumed in August 1944. The advance moved faster than the defensive plan could implement itself, and the defensive position that the plan required was never established because the forces whose establishment of it was required were no longer where the plan projected they would be. The withdrawal of Army Group G, pressed by the American 7th Army from the south and the Free French Army B from the Mediterranean coast, was supposed to converge on the Loire Valley and use the river's defensive potential as the anchor of the reconstituted German defensive line. But the Third Army's advance had already crossed the Loire in August, before Army Group G could reach it, and the river that was supposed to be the anchor of the German defensive line became instead the southern boundary of the American operational area. A logistical inconvenience rather than a military obstacle. The German commander of the Loire garrison sector is General Botho Elster, a name that does not appear in the popular histories of the Western Front campaign with any frequency or any depth, for the reason that a commander whose campaign ends in a negotiated surrender, conducted over the course of several days with French resistance forces and an American army officer on a bridge over the Loire, is not the kind of campaign figure whose profile the military history's standard narrative structure tends to preserve. The military history's standard narrative structure preserves the commanders of decisive battles, the commanders whose operational decisions produce the dramatic outcomes that the narrative frame of military history tends to emphasize. Elster's operational decision was to not fight, which was, in September 1944, the most professionally honest and the most humane decision available to a German commander in the Loire Valley, but which does not generate the narrative profile that the decisive battle produces. He commands a force of approximately 20,000 soldiers, not a neat organizational unit with the chain of command and the established relationships that an operational formation develops through its training and its combat history, but the hodgepodge formation that the German military's catastrophic retreat across France and the Allied advance's speed have assembled in the Loire Valley from the remnants of garrison units whose original defensive assignments have been overtaken by the advance, security forces whose function of guarding the lines of communication was rendered irrelevant when the lines of communication themselves ceased to function, supply troops whose logistical mission has been without the supplies to execute it since August, construction battalions whose road building and fortification work was superseded by the advance, whose pace made every newly built position obsolete before it could be occupied, and the various rear area formations whose original assignments have been rendered irrelevant by the collapse of the front they were supporting. These are not, for the most part, the combat formations of the Wehrmacht's first line, not the Panzer Grenadiers and the parachute infantry, whose professional quality and whose fighting effectiveness have been making the Normandy campaign so costly in American lives since June 6, and whose withdrawal, east in the August pursuit, has stripped the Loire Valley of its most capable German defenders. They are the second and third line, the older soldiers, the Volksdeutsche, and the Eastern European conscripts in German uniform, whose national loyalties to the German military cause are varied, and whose commitment to the resistance that the German command demands of them has been declining with the strategic situation's deterioration. The administrative and support personnel who have been pressed into the improvised defensive formations that the German army's deteriorating manpower situation and its increasingly desperate combing of the rear areas for fighting soldiers has been producing throughout 1944. But 20,000 of them, armed and in position in the Loire Valley's towns and along the river's south bank, represent a force that the French forces of the interior and the small American elements in the area cannot overwhelm by direct assault, and that, if they choose to fight the house-to-house and street-by-street battle of a fortified town, rather than surrender, can produce the casualties and the delay whose operational cost the Allied command would prefer to avoid, when the strategic priority is the drive toward the German border. The question, in the second week of September 1944, is what Elster will choose to do with the strategic situation whose operational logic points in one direction and whose institutional requirements point in another, and whether the negotiated outcome that the French resistance and the American army are constructing in the Loire Valley can be assembled before the situation produces the fighting that neither side can afford to escalate. The fighting whose escalation neither side can afford. The French forces of the interior cannot afford the casualties of assaulting fortified towns with irregular infantry. The American 83rd Infantry Division cannot afford the operational diversion from the Third Army's main effort that a sustained assault on the Loire garrison would require. And Elster's garrison cannot afford the final consumption of the limited supplies, whose exhaustion will produce the surrender anyway, but in the physical degradation of the garrison's soldiers, whose human cost the negotiated surrender avoids. September 10 through 12, 1944. The negotiations that will produce the Loire surrender are being conducted across the negotiating table of a military situation whose participants include actors whose institutional roles in the conventional military structure are not the roles that the Loire negotiations construction requires. The French forces of the interior officers, the resistance leadership in the Loire region, whose specific and documented role in the German garrison's isolation has been the disruption of the supply lines and the communications that the garrison requires for conventional military function, the sabotage of the rail lines and the road network and the fuel depots whose capacity the garrison depends on for its continued operational function, are negotiating from the position of partisans whose military status under the laws of war remains ambiguous in September 1944, even as their operational contribution to the German garrison's isolation has been the decisive factor in producing the strategic situation that makes Elster's surrender the rational professional choice. And Major General Robert Macon, of the American 83rd Infantry Division, is negotiating from the position of a division commander whose authority to accept the surrender of 20,000 German soldiers, to commit the American army to the prisoner of war management of a force larger than his own division, sits at the edge of his delegated authority. Macon is not the commander of a force engaged in sustained combat with Elster's garrison, has not been conducting the kind of set-piece offensive operations that the reduction of a fortified garrison in a series of defended towns normally requires, and whose casualty costs the standard military's accounting of what a successful assault costs, in killed and wounded, would project as significant. He is the commander of a flank security formation, whose mission is to prevent the Loire garrison from interfering with the Third Army's main operations to the north and east, to prevent the 20,000 German soldiers in the Loire Valley from crossing the river and moving to join the German main body, or to attack the Third Army's supply lines, whose vulnerability to interdiction from the Loire garrison the operational planning has identified as the specific threat that the containment mission must address. He has approximately 12,000 soldiers of the 83rd Infantry Division available for the Loire sector, enough to contain the German garrison and prevent its breakout, not enough to assault the fortified positions in the towns and along the river without the kind of sustained set-piece operation that the Third Army's current operational priorities, focused on the drive toward the Siegfried Line, cannot support. The negotiations framework is the specific and operationally unusual construct of a military surrender, conducted without the conventional precondition of military defeat in the field. The surrender whose legitimacy cannot rest on the demonstration that the surrendering force has been beaten in the tactical encounter that the surrender acknowledges, because no such tactical encounter has occurred. Elster has not been defeated in the field. His garrison has not been broken by combat or overwhelmed by an assault whose outcome demonstrated the futility of further resistance. His positions in the Loire Valley are physically intact. The fortifications in the towns are still occupied. The defensive positions along the river are still manned. The command structure that connects his headquarters to the battalion and company commanders has not been disrupted by military action. His soldiers are armed and in their positions, physically capable of the continued resistance that the German command structure would be demanding if the German command structure were capable of issuing such demands, across the operational distance that the Third Army's advance has created. What has changed is the strategic context in which those positions exist. They are now positions that connect to nothing in any direction. No German front line to the east, no German formation to the north, no supply route from the south. Defend nothing that the German military still needs defended in September 1944, and whose maintenance requires the consumption of food and ammunition and fuel and medical supplies that are no longer arriving through a supply chain whose last effective deliveries to the Loire sector were in late August, before the American advance closed the roads and disrupted the communications whose maintenance that supply chain required. The defenders are carrying out orders from a headquarters that is no longer in a position to support them, or to relieve them, or to provide them with the intelligence picture that would allow them to understand what the operational purpose of their continued occupation is, and whose orders, when they do arrive through the increasingly unreliable communications, are increasingly abstract in their references to a front that the Loire garrison can no longer locate on any map. Elster understands this. He is a professional soldier in the specific and documented tradition of the German officer corps, whose professional training has given him the analytical tools to read a strategic situation honestly. He reads the strategic situation in the Loire Valley in September 1944 with the professional honesty of a German officer who has been watching the war's direction change since 1942 and who has the analytical capacity to read the operational situation's implications without the institutional optimism that the German command culture has been requiring of its commanders since Stalingrad. The position is untenable in the operational sense, that a position whose supply has been cut, whose communications with the higher command have been degraded, and whose strategic purpose has been eliminated by the advance that bypassed it, is a position that will eventually fail, regardless of the fighting quality of its garrison. The operational purpose is non-existent in the specific and professional sense that no German operational plan available to Elster assigns the Loire garrison a role in the German military's current situation, that the garrison's continued resistance serves. The human cost of maintaining a defense that will eventually collapse anyway, in illness from the deteriorating sanitation conditions in the occupied towns, in starvation from the declining food supply, in the slow and grinding attrition of the garrison's physical condition and morale, exceeds the professional justification for the continued resistance. The near failure of the Loire negotiation arrives in the specific and documented form of the political and institutional pressures that the negotiated surrender's unusual character is generating on both sides of the arrangement. On the German side, Elster is operating in an institutional environment where the unauthorized surrender of a military formation, the surrender of 20,000 soldiers by their commander without a direct order from OKW, and without the military defeat that the German command structure requires as the precondition for a surrender's legitimacy, carries the specific and documented risk of the consequences that the German military's enforcement mechanism has been imposing on commanders whose capitulations have been judged as premature or unauthorized. The show trials, the summary executions, the family reprisals that the SS and the SD have been implementing against the families of German officers who have been judged as having surrendered prematurely. These are not abstract institutional deterrents in September 1944. They are the specific and immediate context within which every German commander, contemplating the negotiated surrender of his force, must calculate the personal cost, to himself and to his family, of the institutional transgression, whose operational logic is compelling and whose institutional consequences are potentially lethal. Field Marshal Model's orders, the show trials following the unauthorized surrenders at Stalingrad and in North Africa, the string of court-martial proceedings against officers who have surrendered forces that OKW judged capable of continued resistance. These are not abstract threats in September 1944. They are the specific and institutional context within which Elster must calculate the personal risk of the negotiated surrender, whose operational logic is clear, and whose institutional consequences are not. He calculates, he decides. The calculation produces the decision that the operational logic supports and that the institutional risk cannot override. The surrender whose terms he is now negotiating across the table from the French and American officers who will receive it. On the American side, the negotiations conduct by French forces of the interior officers, operating in the specific and institutionally ambiguous position of a resistance organization that has been conducting irregular warfare and that has not yet been fully integrated into the formal Allied command structure in France, and by American officers who are operating at the edge of their delegated authority in the negotiation of a surrender of this scale, creates the specific and institutional problem of whether the surrender agreement's terms and the authority under which it is being negotiated will be recognized by the American chain of command above Macon, by SHAEF, and by the formal military protocols that govern prisoner of war status, and the treatment of surrendering forces under the Geneva Conventions, whose application to forces surrendering to irregular combatants is the specific and documented legal question that the Loire negotiations conduct is raising. September 16, 1944. The surrender is executed on the bridge over the Loire at Beaugency, in the specific and unusual ceremony of a military capitulation, whose character differs from the conventional surrender in the ways that the conventional surrender's participants would notice. There is no destroyed defending force, no overrun defensive position, no final assault whose climax the surrender acknowledges as the culmination of military defeat. The bridge at Beaugency, in the September sun, above the Loire, France's longest river flowing green and indifferent in the late summer, below the medieval bridge, whose stones have seen the passage of armies and the ebb and flow of power across 1,000 years of French history, from the 100 Years' Wars campaigns, to the Revolutionary Wars, to the Franco-Prussian collapse of 1870, to the German army's crossing in 1940, and now, in 1944, to the opposite crossing of a German commander, whose army is going the other way. Elster crosses the bridge and presents himself to the American officers assembled to receive his surrender, crossing in the specific and personal way of a general officer making the walk that the institutional culture of military honor makes the most difficult physical act available to the professional soldier who has spent his career building the institutional identity that the surrender is now formally extinguishing. He crosses. The documents are signed. The orders go out to the Loire Valley's towns. The weapons are collected in the streets that the fighting never came to, from the soldiers whose war ended not on a battlefield but on a riverbank, in the September sun of a France that Patton's army has already left behind. 20,000 German soldiers begin the process of laying down their weapons in the Loire Valley's towns and positions in the specific and documented way of a force that has made the institutional decision to surrender and whose individual soldiers are implementing that decision with the varying degrees of relief and reluctance and resignation that 20,000 different personal calculations of the situation produce. Their physical condition, after weeks of isolation without resupply, reflects the specific and documented deterioration of a garrison that has been consuming its reserves without the logistical pipeline that is supposed to replace them. Reduced rations, declining ammunition, medical supplies that have been stretched beyond the inventory that the original establishment assumed as the baseline for the garrison's medical function, vehicles that are low on fuel and increasingly in need of maintenance that cannot be performed without the parts that the supply chain is no longer delivering. The surrender at Beaugency is a surrender of soldiers who are hungry in the specific and individual way of men whose daily caloric intake has been below the standard that sustained military function requires, whose ammunition has been declining toward the levels that make the continued defense of multiple positions in multiple towns mathematically unsustainable, whose morale has been affected by the combination of physical isolation and the knowledge that the war's outcome is no longer a professional question, is no longer a matter of which operational plan succeeds and which fails, but a personal one. The legacy of the Loire surrender, 20,000 German soldiers, no major battle fought in the Loire Valley itself, the largest single capitulation west of Paris in the entire French campaign of 1944, and one of the largest surrenders of the Western Front's entire operation, is the legacy of an operational phenomenon that the standard military history has consistently undervalued relative to the dramatic combat operations, whose narrative structure of assault and resistance and climactic battle fits more naturally into the conventional story of how wars are decided. The Loire surrender has no Hill 317, no Omaha Beach, no Bastogne corridor. It has a bridge at Beaugency, a German general walking across it in the September sun, and 20,000 soldiers putting down their weapons in the towns of the Loire Valley without a battle being fought for those towns. The Loire garrison's surrender without a fight is not the story of a military victory in the conventional sense of troops attacking and defending, and one side defeating the other, in the tactical encounter whose outcome decides the strategic question. It is the story of a military situation whose outcome was determined not by the fighting in the Loire Valley, of which there was almost none between the American 83rd Infantry Division and the German garrison, but by the fighting 200 miles north and east of it, in the Cobra breakthrough and the Avranches exploitation and the Seine crossing and the drive toward the German border that the Third Army had been conducting since August 1. The fighting that decided the Loire garrison's fate was the fighting that the Loire garrison never experienced directly. The Cobra bombing on July 25th, that the Loire garrison heard about from the reports that arrived from the 7th Army. The Avranches exploitation in August, that the Loire garrison learned about from the increasingly unreliable communications from the German command structure. The Seine crossing in August, whose completion announced that the Third Army had moved east of the Loire Valley and would not be coming back. The fighting whose operational consequence, the advance that bypassed the Loire Valley and left it behind, was felt in the Loire Valley only as the silence of the supply lines, the nominal quality of the communications from the German command structure above, and the specific and daily declining state of the garrison's supplies and morale. The strategic consequence of the Loire surrender was the specific and operational freeing of the 83rd Infantry Division from the containment mission that the Loire garrison's continued presence had been imposing on it. The release of 12,000 American soldiers for operational employment in the campaigns that were developing east of the Loire as the Allied advance approached the Siegfried Line and the German border, whose defense the German army was reassembling in the autumn of 1944. These 12,000 soldiers, freed from the flank security mission by Elster's capitulation on September 16th, represented a meaningful addition to the Allied operational mass at a moment when the supply crisis of September 1944, the shortage of fuel and ammunition that was constraining every Allied formation on the approach to the German border, was making every available soldier's employment a calculated choice. Their release from the Loire containment mission came at exactly the moment when the autumn campaign's demands were making every available formation valuable, and when the supply crisis of September 1944, the shortage of fuel and ammunition that the Red Ball Express was running at its limits to address, was making the operational employment of every available division a calculated choice in which the supply cost of the operation had to be weighed against the operational benefit. They joined the formations pressing toward the Siegfried Line and the Rhine, the formations whose operational employment in October and November and December 1944 would determine the pace of the war's final phase, and whose availability for that employment was in part the product of General Elster's professional decision on September 16, 1944, at Beaugency. The soldiers of the Loire garrison, 20,000 of them processed into the prisoner of war system whose management consumed the logistical resources that the Third Army's supply crisis was already pressing, but whose processing was completed without the additional casualties that a sustained assault on the Loire's fortified towns would have generated, spent the remainder of the war in captivity. Elster himself survived the war and the post-war period without the institutional consequence that the German command structure's enforcement mechanism had made the theoretical risk of his unauthorized surrender. The operational logic of the Loire surrender is the operational logic of the Patton advance, stated in its most efficient and its most complete form. The advance was so decisive in its depth and its pace that it produced surrenders in areas it never reached, by forces it never fought, through the strategic isolation that speed creates more effectively than firepower in the specific and documented operational condition, where the bypassed force's strategic situation becomes untenable faster than the force's defensive capability is degraded by combat. The Loire garrison's 20,000 soldiers were not broken by the Third Army in the direct engagement that the conventional understanding of military defeat requires. They were made irrelevant by it, left in a strategic void whose occupation served no German military purpose that any honest professional assessment could identify, and whose eventual surrender was the product of strategic logic applied honestly by a German commander whose professional training gave him the tools to read the operational situation accurately, rather than the product of tactical defeat in the field. The Loire garrison of 20,000 men did not surrender because those soldiers were defeated in the field in the tactical encounter that the conventional understanding of military surrender requires as its precondition. They surrendered because the Third Army had moved so far and so fast that the war had passed them by, had moved east at a pace that left the Loire Valley behind, not as contested ground, whose control determines the outcome of the campaign, but as irrelevant ground, defended by forces whose continued resistance served no German military purpose that any honest professional assessment could identify. The German soldiers in the Loire Valley's towns could have fought. Some of them wanted to. The specific and documented resistance of officers and NCOs whose institutional formation had built the refusal to surrender into the professional identity whose maintenance the surrender was now extinguishing. The institutional culture of the German military, with its emphasis on the fighting spirit and the refusal to yield ground without the order to yield it, produced in some of the Loire garrison soldiers the specific and individual resistance to the surrender that made the negotiations' completion the painstaking and days-long process that the Beaugency ceremony concluded. Elster knew this. His soldiers knew this. The French resistance fighters who had been disrupting their supply lines knew this. And the American Army officer who received the surrender at Beaugency on September 16 knew this in the specific and professional way of an officer who has been managing the containment of 20,000 soldiers with 12,000 of his own, and who has been watching the strategic logic of the situation produce exactly the outcome that the operational situation's honest assessment projected. The most complete operational victories are sometimes the ones where no shot is fired in the victorious area, where the advance has been so decisive, so deep, and so fast that the opponent's calculation of continuing the fight in the bypassed sector produces only the conclusion that the fight has already been decided somewhere else, far away, in the campaign whose outcome has rendered the continued defense of the bypassed sector irrelevant to any military purpose. That the dignified surrender is the only available response to an operational situation whose outcome the fighting's continuation cannot change. Elster made that calculation honestly in September 1944, made it early enough that the Loire garrison's soldiers were surrendered before the full physical degradation that continued isolation and supply failure would have produced, and walked across the bridge at Beaugency into the captivity that was the most decent outcome available for 20,000 men whose war had been decided, without their knowledge or their participation, on the roads north of the Loire in August 1944.